Sunlight sliced through the gaps in the blinds like a cold knife. The air was thick with a blend of disinfectant and some expensive woody fragrance, nauseatingly familiar. Elena opened her eyes. The ceiling was off-white, with a thin gold trim along its edges. It took her 3 seconds to recognize this apartment, the one she had lived in before 2017, the home Julian had arranged for her. On the nightstand sat an electronic clock, its red numbers flickering, May 20th, 2014, 7:03. Her heart clenched violently. A second ago, she was still in the Sterling Group's top-floor office overlooking the entire city. Vanessa, 6 months pregnant, leaned into Julian's arm and said in a condescending tone, "Elena, take this $5 million and leave. It's better for you, and for us." She remembered her knuckles turning white as she clutched the check, a bitter taste rising in her throat. Julian walked over, his coat still carrying the scent of the shirt she had ironed for him that morning. He looked down at her, his expression almost gentle. "Elena, I still care about you. It's just that we're not right for each other." Not right for each other. 3 years of marriage, she had managed his company's internal affairs, shielded him from the board's hidden daggers, and taken care of his chronically hospitalized mother. In the end, all she got was "not right for each other" and a $5 million check. As the blood rushed to her head, she saw Julian take a step back, afraid of getting dirty. Then came the darkness. Elena sat up abruptly, her fingernails digging into her palms. The pain was so real it made her tremble. She looked down at her hands, delicate, clean, with the diamond ring Julian had given her still on her ring finger. Now that she thought about it, its carat weight wasn't even a fraction of the one he later gave Vanessa. Ecosystem fully loaded. Host confirmed, Elena. Binding successful. A mechanical voice suddenly rang out in her mind, neither warm nor cold, like the alert tone of some advanced AI. Elena froze for a second, instinctively glancing around the room. The curtains hung still, and the air conditioner hummed silently. "You have been reborn on May 20th, 2014. Cause of death in your previous life, acute myocarditis triggered by extreme emotional exhaustion. Your present life initiates the echoes of a lifetime system. This system is not an all-purpose tool, its purpose is to give back to you a tangible form of the emotions and memories that were betrayed in your past life." She slowly unclenched her fingers, which had been digging into her palm, and took a deep breath. "What functions does it have?" "Each day, a random key memory from your previous life will resurface, including business intelligence, interpersonal relationships, and overlooked clues. Current points, 0. The host unlocks deeper echoes through proactive actions. A newcomer's gift pack has been issued, 1 chance at precise foresight, the South of the City Subway Plan, plus enhanced business intuition." The South of the City Subway Plan. Something flashed through Elena's mind. She recalled that in her previous life, in early 2015, that old industrial area south of the city was suddenly included in the new subway line, and land prices tripled overnight. Julian had been kicking himself several times at the time, lamenting how he hadn't seen it coming. The message is in her hands now. System, what exactly is this preview opportunity from the beginner's gift pack? You will receive a printed copy of the core summary of the Qingnan New District Rail Transit Long-Term Plan Outline, 2014 to 2020, which has been placed in the second drawer of your wardrobe. Elena threw off the covers, got out of bed, and stepped barefoot onto the floor. She pulled open the wardrobe drawer. A thin A4 sheet lay quietly inside, the edges of the paper still carrying a lingering warmth, as if just out of the printer. She skimmed through it quickly, her heart pounding faster and faster. This plan was made public a full 8 months earlier than in her previous life. She clutched the paper, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain open a crack. Sunlight streamed in, hitting her face, warm. Downstairs on the street, the plane trees were a lush green, a cyclist passed by leisurely, steam rose from the breakfast stalls, everything was as vibrant as freshly washed fruit. She was alive again. When the doorbell rang, Elena had already finished washing up, changed into a white cotton linen shirt and dark gray trousers, her hair tied in a low ponytail. The person in the mirror had bright eyes, no curve to her lips, but also none of the confusion and fear from her past life. She opened the door. Julian stood outside, impeccably dressed in a suit, followed by a middle-aged man carrying a briefcase, Sterling's legal counsel. "Elena," Julian said as he stepped inside, instinctively reaching out to touch her shoulder. "Let's talk." Elena sidestepped, retreating half a step. "About what?" Julian's hand hovered in midair for a moment before he withdrew it. The familiar "I'm doing this for your own good" expression on his face was exactly as it had been in her past life. "You know, Vanessa and I," he sighed. "I didn't expect things to go this far. But since they have, let's part amicably, all right?" The legal counsel handed over a document at the right moment. Elena took it, the divorce agreement, with terms clearly laid out. She would walk away with nothing, retaining only the $200,000 in savings she had secretly stashed over 3 years, unbeknownst to Julian. Additionally, the agreement included a clause she had overlooked in her past life: the forfeiture of any right to claim shares of the Sterling Group in any form. "Elena, I still care about you," Julian said, softening his tone. "We just weren't meant to be. You're still young. Take this money and start over." Elena lifted her head to look at him. There was a trace of guilt in his eyes, but far more relief, the kind a person feels when they finally shed an old, burdensome load. "Sign it," the legal counsel said, handing her the pen. "It's for the best for both of you." Elena picked up the pen, the tip hovering half a centimeter above the divorce agreement. Her heartbeat pounded in her eardrums, steady and unfamiliar, like war drums echoing over the graves of a past life. Images of Julian's hypocritical tenderness, Vanessa's smugness with her swollen belly, and the moment she had fallen to the ground spitting blood while he took a step back, afraid of dirtying his shoes, all of it fluttered through her mind like torn photographs. She set the pen down. Elena, stroke by stroke, clean and sharp, like severing 3 years of shackles. She slid the signed agreement back to Julian, stood up, and picked up the canvas bag she had packed long ago. At the door, she stopped and turned to look at him once more. "Julian," her voice was as light as the May wind, "I wish you and Vanessa an early bundle of joy." The door clicked shut behind her, locking away all the humiliation of her past life for good. A system notification sounded: "Key choice divorce with nothing completed. Plus 50 points." Elena walked into the morning light, a faint, barely there smile finally curling at the corner of her mouth. In this life, she had redeemed herself first. She walked down the stairs, and the morning breeze swept toward her, carrying the sweetness of May locust blossoms. The canvas bag strap dug into her shoulder, a tangible weight. She felt the edge of the subway map inside and kept walking. Reaching the street corner, she hailed a taxi. "Driver, to the Old Southern District." The Old Southern District felt like a world apart from the rest of the city. The plane trees were denser, the buildings shorter, old vines creeping along the walls. The air held a mixture of dust and the smell of aged paper. Elena had the taxi stop at the intersection and stepped out on her own. The place she was looking for was deep in the alley, a 2-story brick building with peeling dark green paint on its outer walls. A crooked sign hung by the doorway: Chinois Printing House, Southern City Branch. The door was half open, and Elena pushed it and stepped inside. Sunlight slanted in from the narrow windows high above, and fine dust particles floated in the air like specks of gold. An old printing press stood silently in the corner, its cast-iron body rusted a dark red. Beside it, stacks of yellowed pages and trimmed waste paper piled up on a wooden shelf. The smell, ink, pulp, old times, hit her all at once. "Who are you?" A gray-haired old man poked his head out from the back room, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, ink stains on his hands. "Hello," Elena walked over. "I'd like to rent this place." The old man looked her over, a young woman in a white shirt and canvas bag. Nothing about her suggested she was here to do business. "Little girl, this place isn't fit for big deals. The equipment here is ancient." "I'm not in printing," Elena said, glancing around as an image already formed in her mind. Keep those old cast iron machines, clean them up, use them as decor. Mount book clippings under glass tabletops. Fill the walls with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, cast warm yellow light over everything, let the air forever carry the scent of coffee and old paper. Sell books and coffee during the day. What she would do at night, she hadn't completely figured out yet, but the system seemed to have just given a slight tremor. I'm opening a bookstore, she said. A coffee bookstore. The old man watched her for another moment, then suddenly smiled. All right, come in and sit. I'll make you some tea. 2 weeks later, the signboard for Book Café was hung. The wooden board was made of old elm wood that Elena had picked up from a second-hand market, and the characters were written by herself in brush script, a semi-cursive style with a touch of Republic of China flair. Beside the sign hung a string of old brass bells that jingled in the wind. She oversaw every bit of the renovation herself. While the workers hammered and painted up front, she stayed in the small storage room at the back, mulling over the menu. The business intuition enhancement from the system was gradually taking effect, allowing her to vaguely sense what would make people stop in their tracks. She thought long and hard about the coffee menu. In the end, she settled on 3 signature drinks, all placed under the Regret series. Osmanthus latte, with small text beside it, the sweetness of missed chances. That autumn, he first asked you to see a movie, but you had to cancel due to work overtime, and there was never another chance. Black Bitter, subtitle, The Pain of Being Let Down. You stayed up 3 nights perfecting the proposal, and he submitted it to the board under your name. Old Letter Paper, subtitle, Confessions Never Sent. You wrote 17 letters, not one of them ever mailed out. Each cup of coffee came with a handwritten note on deep brown craft paper, written one by Elena herself. As she wrote, the system would occasionally chime in and remind her of how the story tied to that emotion could be resolved, and what the guest might be willing to do after finishing their coffee. On opening day, there were hardly any customers. Elena stood behind the counter, watching passers-by occasionally glance in before moving on. The cast-iron body of the old printing press was polished to a gleam, and beside it sat a potted monstera. Golden evening light slanted in through the high windows, casting a glow over the spines of the old books on the shelves. She made herself an osmanthus latte, carried it to the window, and sat down. She had used little sugar, so the fragrance of osmanthus rushed up first, followed by the bitterness of coffee. She remembered the first time she saw Julian, it was also in May. He was giving a talk about entrepreneurship in the school auditorium. She was sitting in the 3rd row. When he finished and walked down, he paused as he passed her and said, "Classmate, you take very attentive notes." Back then, there was light in his eyes. Later, that light slowly turned into calculation. Suddenly, the system notification sounded, echo-triggered, June 12, 2014, 7 p.m. The first guest will walk into Books and Brew Café. This person provided significant help to you in a past life, which you did not notice. Recommendation, pay attention. Elena set down her cup and looked toward the door. The copper bell hung quietly. The alley outside was shrouded in twilight, and the plane trees rustled in the breeze. The first guest arrived 3 days later. It rained that day, a sudden June downpour that darkened the alley in an instant, rain pelting loudly against the plane leaves and the roof tiles. Elena was leaning over the counter, writing new little cards, when she heard the copper bell chime. She looked up. A man stood at the doorway, closing his umbrella and scraping the mud off his shoes on the doormat. He was tall, wearing a dark gray shirt with sleeves rolled up to his forearms, his wet hair slightly disheveled, but his eyes were bright. His gaze swept across the entire Book Café before finally landing on her. "Are you open?" he asked, his voice low and slightly muffled by the sound of the rain. Elena nodded. "We're open. Come in." He leaned his umbrella against the door and stepped inside. His pace slowed for a moment as he passed the row of old bookshelves, his gaze lingering on the weathered spines for 2 seconds. Then he walked to the counter and glanced at the menu on the chalkboard beside it. "An osmanthus latte with less sugar," he said. As Elena made the coffee, she caught a glimpse of him in her peripheral vision, sitting in the single armchair by the window. He took out his phone, glanced at it, and put it back, then casually pulled a book from the bookshelf beside him. She brought the coffee over, a small card resting on the tray. He took it, his gaze lingering on the card for a moment. Missed sweetness, he read aloud, his tone flat, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Interesting. Go ahead and try it, Elena said. I used less sugar, so the osmanthus flavor will take a little longer to come through. He took a sip, squinting slightly as he nodded. Elena turned to head back to the bar when she suddenly heard him say from behind, "This place was tough to find, but worth it." She looked back, and he had already lowered his head to flip through a book. From her angle, she could just make out a small pattern embroidered on the inside of his shirt cuff, silver, like a crescent moon. The system silently triggered a notification. Echo confirmed, this individual is linked to a past life anonymous benefactor. Unlocking detailed information requires 500 points, current points, 320. Elena returned to the bar, her heartbeat a little faster than usual. She wiped the glasses without a change in expression, watching the man through the gaps in the bookshelf. He read with focused attention, occasionally lifting his cup for a sip, as the rain grew louder outside. That day he sat there until the rain stopped, nearly 2 hours. When he left, he put the book back on the shelf, passed by the counter with a slight nod to her. The copper bell chimed once, and he disappeared into the alleyway. After that, he started coming every few days. Sometimes in the afternoon, sometimes in the evening. Each time, he ordered a osmanthus latte with less sugar and sat in the same spot. Sometimes he flipped through a book, other times he tapped away on his laptop. Elena noticed he wasn't much of a talker, but every time he came, he'd wash his cup and place it back on the counter. Once, unable to hold back, she said as he set down his cup, "You always wash your cup yourself, you don't need to be so polite." He paused for a moment, then smiled. It was the first time Elena had seen him smile, a few fine lines at the corners of his eyes, unexpectedly gentle. "Just a habit," he said. "No need to go out of your way." "My name's Nathaniel," he said, extending his hand. "I work around here." Elena shook his hand, dry, firm. "Elena." "I know," he said, then let go and picked up his coat. "See you next week." He walked out, the copper bells jingling. Elena stood there, watching his figure disappear at the alley's entrance, the questions in her mind growing larger. He said "I know what?" Knew her name? Or knew something more? In early July, the city's southern subway plan was officially announced. The day the news broke, a long line formed outside Book Café. In reality, the plan only briefly mentioned the old southern district, but the sharp-eyed young crowd had already caught a whiff of cultural renaissance. On social media, someone posted a photo of the cafe, vintage printing presses, yellowed pages used as tabletops, osmanthus lattes, and small cards, and it went viral overnight, with over 10,000 shares. Standing behind the counter, Elena looked at the sudden influx of people and took a deep breath. She had stocked up on coffee beans and milk a week in advance and had even hired 2 part-time staff. Yet the line still stretched out the door, all the way to the sycamore tree outside. Closing up that night, she leaned against the counter, her shoulders aching with exhaustion, but a smile still lingered on her lips. System pop-up, Book Café popularity threshold reached. Reward, 200 points. Unlocked Echo Fragment, September 2014, details of the environmental protection meeting with Sterling Group's supply chain partners, including the remedial action timeline and list of personnel involved. Current points, 520. Elena sat up instantly. She opened the system interface, and the echo appeared in text form. She read through it quickly, then slowly curled the corners of her mouth into a smile. Julian, so this is where you started pulling the strings. In the first week of September, Elena registered a company called New Moon Culture. The registered capital came from the $5 million she had set aside, and she kept the remaining funds for expanding the Book Café. On the day of registration, she went to the administrative hall alone. After waiting in line for 2 hours, just as she received the business license, the system buzzed, commercial entity registration complete. Reward points, 100. Business intuition enhancement upgrade. She clutched the thin piece of paper as she walked out of the hall, the sunlight making her squint. Crescent culture, crescent. She recalled that rainy day, the silver moon on the inside of Nathaniel's cuff. She didn't know why she had chosen those 2 words. That same month, she used a supply chain vulnerability tip provided by the system to pull off a small move. At the time, the Sterling Group was bidding on a supporting services project for a medium-sized cultural and creative park, and Julian was determined to win. Through an intermediary company, Elena anonymously submitted supplementary materials to the bidding party, questioning the environmental compliance of one of Sterling's supply chain partners. The materials weren't fatal, but they were enough to make the bidding party require Sterling to resubmit its qualification review. As the review cycle dragged on, the project missed its window and was awarded to another company. After Julian lost this project, Elena heard that he had smashed a cup in his office. She sat by the window of the Book Café, holding an osmanthus latte, watching the sycamore leaves outside begin to turn yellow, and felt that the coffee was especially fragrant today. But what really made her feel that things were beginning to shift was a day in mid-October. That afternoon, when Nathaniel arrived, his expression was off. As usual, he ordered a low-sugar osmanthus latte, but after sitting down, he didn't open his book for a long time, just staring blankly out the window. It was raining again, a fine, dense autumn rain, tapping against the sycamore leaves with a crisp sound. Elena hesitated for a moment, then brought a cup of hot milk over and placed it on his table. "On the house," she said. "You look like you need this today." He came back to his senses, looked at the milk, then at her. "Thank you." He took a sip and was silent for a moment before suddenly saying, "Elena, why did you open this Book Café?" She sat down across from him. "I wanted to give myself a place to start over." "Start over," he repeated the phrase, let out a faint, bitter smile. "Sounds easy." "It's actually not that hard when you do it," Elena said. "You take it one step at a time, and when you finally look back, you realize you've already come a long way." Nathaniel looked at her, his gaze deep and intense. The sound of rain filled the few seconds of silence. Then he said, "I've been looking into some things lately, things that might involve some people, and it could put those close to me in danger." Elena felt her heart skip a beat. She remembered what the system had told her, that in his past life, he had once helped her anonymously. She bit her lip and said something that even surprised herself, "If you need help, you can tell me." Nathaniel lowered his eyes, his fingertips turning the glass of milk. "There are still some things I need to confirm," he said. "Once I do, I'll tell you." That day, as he was leaving, he paused at the doorway and turned back to look at her. "Elena," he said, "be careful of Sterling's people." The copper bell jingled, and he was gone. Elena stood behind the bar, her fingers gripping the rag, turning his words over and over in her mind for a long time. Watch out for Sterling's people. Did he know about her and Julian? Or was the thing he was investigating itself related to Sterling? A notification popped up on the system, affinity increased. Nathaniel's trust plus 15%. Current available side quest, The Truth of the Anonymous One, requires 800 points. Current points, 620. Still 180 short. Elena tossed the rag into the sink, thinking she'd just have to try a little harder. In November, the regret-sharing session at the Book Café officially launched. Every Friday at 7:30 p.m., the main lights are turned off, leaving only the warm yellow pendant light above the bar and the small candles on each table. Participants can drop their written regrets into an old tin mailbox. Elena draws 3 slips each week and, using fragments of information from the system, helps them fulfill their wishes step by step. The first week, a slip was drawn that read, "I want to cook a meal for my mom, but she passed away in 2012. I don't even remember what her favorite food was." The system vibrated, echo-triggered. This person's mother once ran a wonton stall at the old vegetable market in the southern part of the city, famous for her shepherd's purse and pork filling. In 2011, she was interviewed by a local tabloid, and the interview archive is stored in the local documents section of the city library. The next day, Elena went to the city library, dug out that old newspaper, and made a copy of the feature article. She placed the copy in an envelope and attached a small card. The shepherd's purse and pork wontons your mother made were the best in the southern part of the city. On the winter solstice, make a bowl for yourself. The third week, the man came again, gently placing the envelope on the counter, his eyes red, and said, "Thank you." The second regret she picked was written by a young girl. I've had a crush on a senior for 3 years but never dared to tell him. He's going abroad next month. The system gave her a piece of information. That senior goes to the old bookstore near the school every Wednesday afternoon to browse for books. Elena sent that tip to the girl anonymously. She never showed up again, but a new line appeared in the Book Café's guest book. I told him, he said he likes me too. Thank you. As these things carried on, the atmosphere of the cafe grew increasingly unique. People didn't just come for coffee anymore, they came to exchange stories. Those little cards were collected and plastered onto a wall beside the counter, called the Wall of Regrets. New customers would always stop in front of that wall for a moment, read the words on each card, and then silently walk over to the counter to order. Every day after closing, Elena would stand in front of that wall and gaze at it for a while. Some handwriting was scrawled, some neat, some bore ink stains blurred by tear streaks. She found herself slowly being healed too, realizing that there were so many people in this world just like her, all carrying unspeakable pain, all clutching their regrets and unable to sleep in the dead of night. She wasn't alone. In December, an invitation to the City Chamber of Commerce's annual banquet arrived at the cafe. As a newly distinguished local merchant in the Southern District, Elena was invited. The invitation was hot-stamped in gold. She flipped it over in her hands, reading it twice, then tucked it into a drawer. That evening, she stood on the small terrace atop the bookstore cafe, gazing at the nightscape of the southern part of the city. In the distance, a new subway station was under construction, the lights on the tower cranes blinking. The winter wind was biting cold, and she wrapped her scarf tighter. "System," she said softly, "I'm ready." The banquet was held at the Intercontinental Hotel ballroom in the city center. Elena wore a dark green velvet gown. Her hair was pinned up, revealing a slender, fair nape. She wore no jewelry, save for a tiny pearl stud earring on each lobe. As she walked in, the light from the crystal chandeliers fell upon her. A few people glanced her way, but most paid her no mind. She picked up a glass of champagne and stood near a pillar in the corner, quietly observing the entire scene. Then she saw Julian. He was wearing a navy blue suit, with Vanessa on his arm in a champagne-colored long dress. Her belly had already begun to show slightly, but her waist was still elegantly cinched. The two were exchanging pleasantries with several Chamber of Commerce directors. Julian raised his glass with the same composed and confident demeanor, just as he had in her past life. Vanessa saw her first. The woman walked over with a wine glass in hand, her high heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, a smile on her lips but coldness in her eyes. "Oh, isn't this Elena?" Vanessa stopped and looked her up and down. "I heard you opened a bookstore in the south of the city? How refined." Elena took a sip of champagne and said nothing. Vanessa leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "5 million all spent? Want me to ask Sterling if there's a janitor position open?" Before Elena could speak, a voice suddenly rang out from behind her. "Elena is my guest." Nathaniel walked up from behind her, naturally standing by her side, his frame slightly angled to shield half of her body. He wore a black suit today, with a deep silver-gray tie, standing as tall and sharp as a blade sheathed in its scabbard. Vanessa's expression stiffened. "Nathaniel? How did you—" "Elena and I have known each other for a long time," Nathaniel said, his tone calm but every word steady and deliberate. "She's my guest tonight." Vanessa's expression flickered, she let out a dry laugh, then turned and walked away. Elena watched her figure disappear into the crowd, then tilted her head to look at Nathaniel. "Have you been nearby all along?" "Just arrived," he said, looking down at her. "I saw you standing here alone, so I came over." His gaze lingered on her face for a second, then shifted away. "You look nice today." A warmth crept up behind Elena's ears, but her face betrayed nothing. "Thank you." The formal part of the banquet began, with the host announcing the year's outstanding enterprises and emerging entrepreneurs. When Elena's name was called, she stood up and gave a slight bow to those around her. The applause was sparse, but she didn't mind. What she minded was what came next. During the free networking session, Julian came over with a glass of wine. He saw Nathaniel standing next to her, and his eyes darkened for a moment, but he quickly put on that composed smile again. "Elena, long time no see. I heard you've been doing well recently?" "Thanks to you," Elena said. "You signed the divorce papers cleanly, so I finally had time to focus on my own things." Julian's smile froze for a moment. He lowered his voice. "That thing, it was you, wasn't it? The Cultural and Creative Park project, did you steal it?" "Just business competition," Elena said, taking a sip of champagne. "You taught me that all's fair in love and war." Julian's composure finally cracked. He took a step forward, and Nathaniel subtly moved to block him, but Elena gently pressed her hand on his arm, stepping forward half a step herself. "Julian," she said, looking him in the eye, her voice low but clear enough, "the environmental compliance record of your supply chain partner, do you want me to make that public right here?" Julian's pupils contracted sharply. How did you know?" "How I know doesn't matter," Elena said. "What matters is that if you don't leave now, the entire city's media will know by tomorrow." Julian's face flushed red and then went pale. His lips moved as if to say something, but in the end, he said nothing and turned to leave. He walked a bit hastily, bumping into a waiter's tray, sending glasses crashing to the floor into a heap of shards. Someone turned to look but quickly averted their gaze. Elena stood still, her palms slightly damp. She had done it. The woman who had knelt before Julian in her past life, begging him not to divorce her, now, standing beneath the chandelier, she had made him flee in shame with just a single sentence. She suddenly felt like laughing. Then a commotion broke out on the other side of the banquet hall. The crowd parted to form a path, and an old man with silver-white hair walked over, leaning on a cane, followed by two assistants. He moved slowly, but each step was steady, his gaze cutting through the crowd and landing squarely on Elena's face. Reginald Hart. Founder of the Hart Group, one of the most senior figures in the city's business world, and Elena's mother Grace's biological father. She never knew this in her past life, not even until her death. It wasn't until her rebirth, when the system gave her fragmented pieces of information, that she began digging through old archives and her mother's belongings, slowly piecing together this truth. Her mother, Grace, had cut ties with the Hart family in her youth, changed her surname, married an ordinary teacher, gave birth to her, and then died of illness when Elena was 12. Reginald Hart had searched for her mother for years, but never found her. Elena tightened her grip on the wine glass in her hand. The old man walked up to her and stopped, tapping his cane lightly on the ground. He looked at her, his gaze moving inch by inch across her features, as if trying to recognize something distant. "Your name is Elena," he spoke, his voice aged but clear. "Yes." "Your mother, her name is Grace?" Elena nodded. The old man was silent for a few seconds. The room was so quiet that she could hear the hum of electricity in the crystal chandelier. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his suit and pulled out a faded photograph, handing it over. Elena took it and saw a young woman in the photo with two braids, wearing a floral dress, standing under an old locust tree, smiling. It was exactly as she remembered her mother. On the back of the photo was a line of small handwriting, "Grace, 20 years old." Beside it, there was another line of lighter writing that read, "If you ever come back, Dad will be waiting for you here." Elena's nose suddenly tingled. She bit her lip and handed the photo back. the old man didn't take it. "Keep it," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "I've been looking for you and your mother for over a decade. A couple of days ago, someone showed me a photo from that bookstore cafe in the south of the city. You were standing behind the counter, smiling, exactly like your mother." He reached out his hand, palm up, trembling slightly. "Elena, I'm your grandfather." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone knocked over a wine glass, someone else dropped their phone. Elena heard Vanessa's shrill voice behind her, "How is that possible?" But she didn't turn around. She looked at the old man in front of her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, but he held them back. She placed her hand in his. "Grandfather," she said. The old man tightened his grip on her hand, his knuckles turning white from the force. That night when Elena left the hotel, it was snowing outside. Snow was rare in this city. Tiny flakes, carried by the wind, struck her face with a cool, damp touch. Nathaniel walked beside her, shielding her from the wind. The two walked in silence for a stretch, all the way to the parking lot. "You knew all along?" Elena asked. "When I was investigating Sterling, I came across some old matters," Nathaniel said, his breath turning into white mist in the cold air. "Old Mr. Hart has also been looking into your mother's whereabouts, and I helped him confirm some information." He paused, turning to face her. "My initial intention for coming to the Book Café was indeed to investigate Sterling. But later..." Snow fell on his shoulders, quickly turning into tiny droplets of water. "Later, every time I went, it was just because I wanted to." Elena looked at him. The streetlight fell across his face, a few snowflakes clinging to his eyelashes, his eyes bright. She recalled the anonymous transfer she had received in her past life, back when she had just divorced, with less than 20,000 yuan to her name, barely able to afford the rent. Waking up one day, she found an extra 150,000 yuan in her bank account, with only a single word in the memo, "Peace." Later, there were a few more times, someone had anonymously recommended her for scattered translation and copywriting gigs. The work wasn't too demanding, the pay was fair, and it was just enough to help her get through that hardest time. She had never known who it was. "That money," she said softly, "the 150,000, with peace in the memo. That was you." Nathaniel was slightly startled for a moment, then nodded. Elena lowered her head, looking at the thin layer of snow that had settled on her shoes. She didn't speak for a long time. "Let's go." She finally lifted her head, a faint smile on her face, her eyes slightly red. "Back to the bookstore cafe. I'll treat you to some hot milk." When spring arrived, new buds sprouted from the plane trees on the old street in the southern part of the city. The tender green leaves trembled faintly in the wind, and sunlight filtered through the branches, dappling the bluestone path with dancing flecks of gold. In March, the Sterling Group officially declared bankruptcy. The process lasted nearly 4 months. After Elena took over the Hart Group, leveraging her past life memories and the information progressively unlocked by the system, she dismantled Sterling's foundations thread by thread. Financial fraud, bribery records, supply chain violations. The chain of evidence was as complete as a meticulously built tower of blocks. She removed one piece at a time, and finally gave it a gentle push. In the middle of it, Julian retaliated once. At some industry forum, he spread rumors that Elena had returned from Rebirth with precognitive abilities, trying to paint her as a delusional lunatic. But Elena had already prepared a comprehensive analysis of her business decisions, publicly disclosed her reasoning and data sources, and casually turned the rumor into slander born of a rival's chagrin. After that, Julian never stirred up trouble again. Vanessa contacted Elena in mid-February. She sent a very long text message, essentially saying that Julian had deceived her, claiming Sterling had substantial assets and a bright future, which was why she had gone with him. Now she was about to give birth, and there was nothing left. Attached were several records of Julian's asset transfers. After reading the message, Elena was silent for a moment, then handed those records over to the legal team. She didn't particularly hate Vanessa. That woman was just a refined egoist, clinging to Julian when he was riding high and jumping ship when it started to sink. Elena even felt a bit of sympathy for her, but only a bit. In mid-March, the day the court's bankruptcy ruling came down, it rained. Just like the day she was reborn 5 years ago, a fine, dense spring rain washed the entire city clean. Elena drove past the old Sterling Group office building, noticing the ceiling strips on the door and the dust settled on the glass entrance. Julian stood across the street, his suit crumpled, his hair plastered to his forehead from the rain. He spotted her car and suddenly rushed over, blocking its path. Elena hit the brakes, watching him through the windshield. His lips were moving, but the rain and the glass muffled his words, though she recognized the shape his mouth made. "Please." Elena rolled down the window. Rain blew in, landing on her face. "Julian," she said, her voice calm, "you once told me to take 5 million and get out of this city." Julian's face turned pale. He tried to speak, but his lips trembled, unable to form words. "Now I'm giving those 5 words back to you," Elena said. "Take whatever you have left and leave this city." She rolled up the window and stepped on the gas. In the rearview mirror, Julian's figure grew smaller and smaller, until it was swallowed by the rain. The system prompt echoed in her mind, "Main quest revenge completed. 500 points rewarded. Hidden quest letting go of regret triggered, use the way you forgive yourself to complete the final echo. Do you accept?" Elena pulled the car over to the side of the road, leaned back in the seat, and closed her eyes. The rain pattered finely and densely against the roof. She recalled her past life, herself collapsing and spitting blood on the ground, and remembered the eyes she saw in the mirror on the first day after being reborn. "I accept," she said. Hidden quest in progress. The host must, within 7 days, go to the Book Café Wall of Regrets and write down the greatest regret of her past life. That evening after the bookstore cafe closed, Elena stood alone in front of the Wall of Regrets. The warm yellow light fell softly, and the small cards densely covered the entire wall, each one holding a story of someone's life. She took a blank craft paper card from the drawer of the bar counter and picked up a pen. The tip of the pen hovered over the paper for a long time. Outside the window, the spring rain pattered softly, while the old printing press stood silently in the corner like a guardian deity. She finally wrote down one line, "I used to think that love was begging on my knees. Later, I came to understand that love is standing tall and giving freely." She walked to the small courtyard at the back, rainwater dripping from the eaves, splashing tiny droplets on the bluestone slabs. She struck a match and lit the card. The flame curled up from the edges, its orange glow reflecting in her eyes. The paper ash spiraled upward, dampened by the raindrops, and fell to the ground. The system prompt sounded, softer than ever before, "Hidden quest completed. Reward, happiness perception permanently enhanced. Host, you are free." Elena stood in the rain, tilting her head back. The rainwater fell on her face, cold, but inside her chest, a warmth rose, slowly spreading through her entire being. She suddenly felt like crying, and laughing too, but in the end she only curved her lips upward and let out a long, slow breath. Footsteps sounded behind her, and someone held an umbrella over her head. Elena turned around. Nathaniel stood beneath the umbrella, one shoulder soaked, 2 cups in his hands. He handed her one, hot, an osmanthus latte, less sugar. "Figured you hadn't left yet," he said. Elena took it, cradling it in her hands. The fragrance of osmanthus rose with the steam, mingling with the scent of rain. She leaned over, resting her forehead lightly against his shoulder. "Thank you." Nathaniel raised his free hand, hesitated for a second, then placed it on her back, softly, steadily. The rain fell all night. By morning, it had stopped. The sun came out, and the water droplets on the plane tree leaves sparkled. Elena stood on the rooftop terrace of the Book Café, watching the old southern neighborhood slowly awaken in the morning light. In the distance, a tower crane swung, and the outline of the new metro station had already taken shape. From below came the chime of a copper bell, an early guest was pushing open the door. Nathaniel approached from behind and set a cup of warm milk beside her hand. Any plans for today? Elena picked it up, took a sip, and gazed into the distance. I want to turn the Book Café into a chain, she said. The first branch will be at the old grain warehouse in the east part of town. And then? She paused, tilted her head to look at him, fragments of sunlight dancing in her eyes. And then, the rest of my life is still long. No need to rush. Nathaniel smiled and reached out to tuck her wind-blown hair behind her ear. Take your time, he said. The young leaves on the plane tree in front of the Book Café were swaying in the wind. The copper bell chimed once more as someone pushed the door open and walked in. The wall was densely covered with regret cards, but at the very center, a small patch was empty, a blank left by the card that had been burned the night before. Sunlight streamed in and fell upon that empty space, warm and gentle. In the distance, pigeons fluttered up, circled the eaves of the old town for a moment, and then flew off into the bluer sky.